Not often I'll do a video on a video, but this actually comes from a DVD a friend of mine on the Labour Party Great Yarmouth Labour Party website published, and it is so good I just want to make a few comments about it, and I'll try and put the link in the description or somewhere, okay? This is fairly much off the cuff, but it's called The Shock Doctrine, and it's by Renegade Productions, and it's based on the work of Naomi Kline, and it was produced by Renegade Productions in 2009, so nearly 10 years ago, okay? He quoted it because it is tremendously insightful about, if you like, how we've got into the position that we're in now. Primarily deals with America, and it's a historical perspective on what I think a lot of people now are calling disaster capitalism or crisis capitalism. It relates back primarily, and if you watch the video, I really do encourage you to do this, to the story of the economist Milton Friedman and free market economics. You'll realise, I'm sure, or at least you'll know historically, Margaret Thatcher and the Tories were great fans of Milton Friedman. She fancied him being, I don't know, every kind of honour possible, because he was an economic theorist that really appealed to neoliberalism. Now, it links also, the reason I believe that this has been called the Shock Doctrine, is it links to some sort of early forms of what might have been called psychological treatment or treatment for mental illness. In fact, it was later found out to be brainwashing, but bear with me for a second and I'll explain how this works, okay? It was felt that if you gave somebody enough sensory deprivation, if you gave them electric shocks and subliminal messages in their sleep, you could sort of wipe their slate clean on their consciousness. You could just wipe them as a blank sheet of paper, and you could reprogram them as human beings. This idea of reprogramming, it was often spoken of as deprogramming in my youth, when it would relate to cults like the Moonies and whatever, capturing people and Jonestown and all that lot, and holding them in their thrall and changing their way of thinking. So much so that, to remember the Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre, and the phrase was developed then, it was called drinking the Kool-Aid. Jim convinced all of his followers that Armageddon or whatever was coming, and they were going to be just attacked and killed by the godless hordes who didn't believe what he did. So the only noble thing to do was mass suicide. And they did indeed drink the poison Kool-Aid, and, well, the footage from Jonestown is horrific. But it shows that people can be brainwashed. Now let's take that, as this documentary will explain to you, into the free market economists like Milton Friedman. One thing that you still see, just how driven by this the Tories are, is let the market sort it out. Nothing should be free. I don't know if it was Friedman, but one of the economists said there is no such thing as a free lunch. Healthcare should cost you. If you don't have the money to look after your own health, if you don't have the money to treat disease which can afflict anybody, then the market will decide that you should die. That's how the NHS is viewed by the Tories. It's got to be subject to the free market. So much so that in America, now, even personal security is subject to the free market. People are buying bodyguard and security services because the police force and whatever can't cope. So Friedman thought that he would, if this kind of free market model couldn't be imposed on a society, if couldn't be sort of just agreed to and taken up by a society, well, it should be imposed on them. Now, Friedman realised in those days that the CIA did a lot to destabilise countries, especially when they had sort of socialist or communist governments in charge, especially in the case of Chile, which was doing really pretty well. It had elected a socialist leadership. It had elected a socialist premier. There was a national education system. That was free. There was a national insurance and a national health service system. Ordinary families earned a decent wage, and if people were in a position where they couldn't support their family through work or sickness or whatever, a bit like in the UK, this national insurance system kind of kicked in, and the Chileans were looked after perfectly well. And if you like, it was a kind of a victory, or at least it was a society organised along socialist or communal grounds where, you know, we see to each other's needs, we help each other, we share the fruits of the earth, we share the fruits of our labour, and wealth does not get concentrated into the hands of an absolute few. Now, of course, Friedman wanted to try, free market economics, the market system. The market would be the great leveller. Let the market decide. But America wasn't taking to it very well at the time, and the government in America were kind of a little bit more liberal, and they kind of, mixed economy, stuff like that. Stuff like the Labour Party was, perhaps even in the 30s. Something like during the war, after the war, for example, and this programme states it, Europe was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan. Although, we'd been responsible for the devastation of the war, obviously we were fighting the fascists, we were fighting the Nazis, and of course they had virtually put Europe in ruins. So the Marshall Plan, organised by Roosevelt and whatever, was like a loan to reconstruct the rest of Europe and get the economy going again and get people taking care of themselves and get people having a proper standard of living, repairing housing, infrastructure, roadways, sanitation, fuel, everything. This was all rebuilt by these loans from America under the Marshall Plan. And it was considered a really good thing to do because, let's face it, if you leave every person in Europe living in poverty, degradation, filth, and practically swimming around in sewage because you've destroyed the infrastructure through bombs, well, that could kind of provoke a bit more hostility in Europe, couldn't it? So they borrowed the money. Roosevelt lent it to them. The Marshall Plan was part of rebuilding Europe and rebuilding the post-war world. Milton Friedman, though, and his free market economists were very much against it. Just like the Tories were very much against the NHS. The market should be the great leveller. And, nobody should help anybody out. And if 10,000 people need to starve or die of typhoid because we can't afford the treatment, then 10,000 people starve and die of typhoid, and those people who are rich enough and who have taken the fruits of the earth and have kept it all for themselves, then they're the ones who survive. So again, we see the kind of Tory idea here of a kind of social Darwinism. Yeah, if you're strong enough to survive, if you're strong enough to make the money, if your genes will get you through, if your privilege and your position will get you through, then you should survive the next epidemic and everybody else should die. Now, the point I want to go specifically back to on this program, and you just watch the whole program, because although I've made notes on it, I can't possibly summarise from notes here. But the point I want to go back to is this. Let's just go back to Chile, and let's go back to America, thinking that they want to impose these free market economics on absolutely everybody, and that they're not doing it particularly well in America, because the US has elected presidents and whatever that are a bit more sort of I don't know, a bit more social, a bit more for the people, a bit more into a kind of mixed economy, if you like, yeah. And they don't mind nationalising things, and things are being nationalised in America, and they are working really well. And the people feel that they really have a stake in their society. And society's doing great, and the resources are all being shared out pretty much fairly and squarely. Okay, it's still an economy. But they thought, well, let's see what happens if we can depose by military coup this socialist regime in Chile, and we'll just get our CIA agents in there, and we'll try good old Milton Friedman, free market, free for all, disaster capitalism. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. There's a massive military coup. The leader, a guy called, I think, Allende, is killed, and the infamous General Pinochet takes over. Now, remember General Pinochet. Please remember the name. Thatcher, great friend of him. Pinochet was a fascist, a dictator, a torturer, a murderer, the kind of person under which people will disappear. They just go away and don't come back. The kind of person who would torture members of the football team if they don't score enough goals. A bit like the dictator in Argentina, Perón, and all that lot. Yeah, a bit like that. Okay, so but the CIA deposed the socialist regime and supposed to give free market capitalism and whatever a damn good go. Yeah, and it fails. Under Pinochet, the people are repressed, the standard of living drops, people are starving, people are living in hovels, people are dying on the streets. But guess what? Oh, what always happens in this system, the transfer of wealth and resources and ultimately power to the rich top percent, 5 or 6%, right, happens. They are living in oligarchical luxury, like the oligarchs in the former Soviet Union, which is now Russia. These oligarchs are living in luxury, and everybody else in Chile is suffering. Actually suffering. So, there's free market capitalism and good old fascism, just like in World War II with Hitler. Free market capitalism and good old fascism, hand in hand, hand in hand, hand in hand. And that, my friend, is exactly the kind of system that the Tories are bringing back. So please, just watch the video in the link if you can, okay? I hope you enjoy it, but thanks to my friend who shared it on the Great Yarmouth Labour Party, because it's a really interesting video, okay? But remember, we don't just come about now, we come about as a result of our history, and that's just where right-wing neoliberal economics and politics are leading us, ultimately into the arms of fascism.